In March 1945, German defenders waiting along the Rhine River anticipated a predictable threat: slow, vulnerable Allied bridging operations that concentrated artillery could easily destroy. Instead, out of the muddy staging areas rolled long lines of DUKWs, oddly shaped, completely unarmored, and fragile-looking amphibious trucks. Without pausing, they drove straight off the banks into a churning 5 to 7 knot current. By every rule of military logic, these awkward vehicles, originally built for flat ocean beaches, should have been swept downstream or ripped apart in minutes. Instead, they plunged into the raging river, defying everything the German High Command expected. Crossing the Rhine was never just a matter of getting infantry to the eastern bank. It was a brutal mathematical race against time. The moment the first Allied soldiers set foot on German soil, a ticking clock began. German military doctrine demanded an immediate, overwhelming counterattack to crush any isolated bridgehead before it could be reinforced. To survive, the Allies had to move thousands of tons of ammunition and heavy weapons across the water faster than the Wehrmacht could mobilize its panzers. Relying on a single pontoon bridge or ferry crossing meant risking everything on a static target. One lucky artillery strike could sever the entire supply line. To prevent this, Allied planners engineered a relentless, overlapping web of transport. Stormboats, heavy rafts, and Bailey bridges were all pushed into service simultaneously. But bridging operations took precious hours to assemble under fire, and traditional ferries required vulnerable loading docks. This is where the DUKW fundamentally altered the logistical equation. It offered something the other methods couldn't: unbroken momentum. A DUKW could load artillery shells at a supply dump miles inland, drive directly into the water, navigate the channel, and deliver its cargo straight to the fighting positions without ever stopping to transfer its load. It provided a critical layer of redundancy. If a bridge was hit, the ferries kept running. If a ferry sank, the amphibious trucks kept rolling in a continuous loop. Yet, the DUKW was a cumbersome, thin-skinned machine that sat dangerously low in the water. How did these highly vulnerable, completely unarmored vehicles manage to survive the treacherous currents of the Rhine and ensure the invasion never stalled? To understand how this fragile lifeline held together, we first have to look at the massive, deadly trap waiting for the Allies on the river itself. In the spring of 1945, the Rhine River was not just a geographic boundary, it was a violent force of nature, acting as the ultimate defensive moat for the German homeland. Water conditions in March presented a worst-case scenario for military operations. Fed by heavy winter snowmelt and relentless spring rains, the river was swollen far beyond its normal banks, creating treacherous floodplains and hiding submerged obstacles beneath its murky surface. More critically, this massive volume of water was moving at a devastating speed of 5 to 7 knots. For a civilian observer, that might just look like a fast-moving river. But for military engineers evaluating the crossing, a 7-knot current was an absolute physical nightmare. At that speed, the water ceases to be a simple surface to cross and becomes a relentless, heavy battering ram that violently pulls at anything attempting to float, dragging vessels sideways and threatening to swamp low-riding hulls. The German High Command integrated the river's brutal hydrology directly into their defensive strategy. The Wehrmacht, defending the eastern bank, was severely depleted of armor and suffering from catastrophic fuel shortages. But it was far from defenseless. What they lacked in tanks, they made up for with highly experienced artillery crews and a lethal defensive doctrine. German artillery observers had spent the previous months meticulously mapping every inch of the western shoreline. They possessed a terrifying advantage: pre-registered firing coordinates. They knew exactly where the banks were flat enough for vehicles. They knew where the gaps in the dikes provided natural staging areas. And they knew precisely where the Allies would logically attempt to build their bridges. German mortar teams and crews manning the infamous 88mm flak guns were dug into elevated positions and camouflaged on the eastern ridges. They did not need to see their targets perfectly through the fog or battle smoke. They only had to wait for the predictable sounds of heavy construction and drop concentrated fire onto predetermined grid squares. This reality created a paralyzing dilemma for Allied commanders planning the assault. Traditional military doctrine for river crossings relied on massive static infrastructure. The standard procedure pushed infantry across in small boats, secured a tiny foothold, and immediately began constructing heavy pontoon bridges and cable-operated ferries for the tanks and supply trucks. But assembling a heavy tactical bridge, like a pneumatic treadway or a steel Bailey bridge, is a slow, agonizing process. Combat engineers are forced to work entirely exposed, pushing massive rubber floats into the freezing water, wrestling heavy steel panels into place, and trying to align a rigid structure against a furious current. Under ideal, peaceful conditions, bridging a 1,000-foot gap takes many hours. Under direct enemy artillery fire, it is a bloody, chaotic endeavor. To a German artillery spotter looking through a pair of Zeiss binoculars, a pontoon bridge under construction was the ultimate dream target. It was a massive, linear structure that couldn't move, couldn't maneuver, and couldn't hide. It was entirely unarmored. A single high-explosive 88mm shell striking a rubber pontoon would instantly shatter the tension of the bridge, sending steel panels crashing into the water and halting the entire crossing process for hours while engineers scrambled to replace the damaged sections. Cable ferries were equally vulnerable. They required fixed loading ramps on both shores. If the enemy zeroed in on those specific ramps, the ferry became useless. This inherent vulnerability represented a terrifying, almost unacceptable risk. Getting the initial assault divisions across the river in small wooden storm boats was dangerous, but it was only the first step. The moment those infantrymen secured a bridgehead on the eastern bank, a brutal countdown would begin. An Allied infantry division in heavy combat burns through roughly 600 to 700 tons of supplies daily, requiring a continuous flow of small arms ammunition, mortar rounds, medical supplies, and food. Furthermore, German defensive doctrine strictly demanded immediate, violent armored counterattacks against any bridgehead before it could consolidate. Relying entirely on a single method of crossing, putting all logistical hope on one or two static pontoon bridges invited disaster. The danger was absolute. If a concentrated German artillery barrage managed to blow a 50-foot hole in a bridge, or if a lucky mortar round sank a heavy ferry, the main logistical artery would instantly sever. The assault divisions, trapped on the eastern bank, would find themselves completely cut off. Within hours, they would run out of ammunition, be unable to evacuate their critically wounded, and face the full weight of German panzer reserves with nothing but the weapons they could carry. It was the nightmare scenario of a trapped beachhead, reminiscent of the disasters at Dieppe or the prolonged agony of Anzio, but on the doorstep of the German heartland. To prevent this catastrophe, Allied planners understood that survival dictated a fundamental shift in strategy. They required an immediate, continuous, and highly mobile logistical support system that did not rely on fixed infrastructure. They needed a supply chain that could entirely bypass the vulnerable choke points of bridgeheads and ferry docks. If a German artillery battery zeroed in on a specific stretch of the shoreline, the supply vehicles had to be able to simply shift their entry point a half-mile up or down the river without waiting for engineers to build new ramps. The logistical web had to be fluid, decentralized, and impossible for enemy spotters to effectively pin down. This absolute requirement for mobile redundancy is exactly what brought the DUKW into the center of the Rhine crossing plans. Inside the quiet planning rooms of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, mathematical models for deploying these amphibious vehicles looked flawless. Logisticians calculated that fleets of these 2.5-ton trucks could load up at supply dumps several miles inland, safely out of range of most German field guns. They could disperse their approach, driving along the muddy roads of the western shore, making it impossible for German artillery to concentrate their fire on a single staging area. This tactical vision appealed immensely to commanders desperate to avoid a bottleneck. The DUKWs would simply drive off the banks, dynamically enter the water wherever needed, cross the river, and drive straight up the eastern bank, delivering ammunition directly to the front-line foxholes. If a pontoon bridge was destroyed, the amphibious trucks would keep rolling, acting as an invisible, floating highway that could instantly change routes. In theory, this decentralized, mobile supply line was the perfect countermeasure to the rigid, concentrated threat of German artillery. It eliminated the fatal vulnerability of static targets. But military theory is almost always written in sterile environments, far removed from the deafening roar of heavy water and incoming shrapnel. The officers drawing up these logistical timetables and capacity charts were largely basing their calculations on the vehicle's past performance during ocean landings like those in Sicily and Normandy. The DUKW was engineered for the specific challenges of a beach assault. Designed to navigate breaking ocean waves and pull its heavy chassis onto a sloping sandy shore, it was fundamentally a modified commercial truck wrapped in a thin, unarmored steel boat hull. It was never designed, nor was it adequately powered, to fight a heavy, churning river current that acted like a continuous, sideways battering ram. The trucks sat dangerously low in the water, especially when loaded to their maximum cargo capacity with heavy artillery shells. Even a minor miscalculation in steering or a sudden shift in weight could result in water pouring over the low gunnels, instantly swamping the vehicle. The planners had effectively bet the survival of thousands of infantrymen on the mechanical endurance of an unarmored, deeply loaded, and underpowered truck operating far outside its intended design parameters. As 0 hour approached, the stark physical reality of the Rhine loomed heavily over the entire operation. The theory of maintaining a fluid, untargetable supply line sounded perfect in headquarters, but the moment those heavy rubber tires actually left the mud and hit the freezing, violently fast-moving water, the brutal reality of the river almost destroyed the entire plan. On the night of March 23, 1945, the initial assault waves launched into the darkness. Infantrymen from the U.S. 9th and 3rd Armored Divisions crowded into traditional wooden storm boats and small assault skiffs, pushing away from the western shore. Caught in the sweeping glare of German flares, these fragile boats faced intense, concentrated fire from the eastern bank. The surviving infantry who scrambled up the muddy embankments managed to secure a series of shallow, highly precarious footholds, but they were isolated, exhausted, and running dangerously low on ammunition. Within hours, urgent radio transmissions began filtering back to the command posts. The bridgehead desperately needed heavy mortars, anti-tank ammunition, and medical evacuation. This was the signal for the DUKWs to enter the breach. Along the muddy staging areas, long convoys of amphibious trucks shifted out of low gear, their heavy rubber tires churning through the marshland. Without pausing, they descended the steep, slippery banks and plunged directly into the Rhine. The moment the front wheels lost contact with the riverbed and the buoyant hulls floated free, the terrifying physics of the river took control. For the drivers sitting in the open cabs, the transition was a violent shock. Most of these quartermaster crews had been trained for ocean amphibious assaults. They had learned to read coastal surf, timing their approaches to ride the rhythmic swells of the English Channel or the Mediterranean. But a flooded river behaves entirely differently than an ocean beach. There were no predictable waves to ride. Instead, there was a continuous lateral wall of water, moving at over 12 feet per second, acting like a giant, relentless conveyor belt. A standard DUKW weighed over 14,000 pounds empty, and when loaded to its operational limit with crates of artillery shells, it sat low and sluggish in the water. To propel this massive weight, the vehicle relied on a single propeller driven by a standard 104 horsepower truck engine. The mechanical mismatch was instant and alarming. Drivers who instinctively pointed their bows directly toward the beacon lights on the eastern bank immediately committed a fatal error. The violent current caught the flat sides of the thin steel hulls, spinning the trucks sideways and sweeping them rapidly downstream. In those first chaotic minutes, the amphibious supply line teetered on the edge of disaster. Dozens of heavily loaded DUKWs were caught in the grip of the river, hurtling uncontrollably away from their designated landing slips. Directly in their downstream drift path lay half-submerged bridge pylons from demolished spans, jagged steel debris, and stretches of enemy-held riverbank where German machine gun teams were waiting for targets. Survival demanded rapid tactical adaptation. Fighting rising panic, the drivers realized their ocean invasion doctrine was useless here. To reach a landing ramp 400 yards directly across the water, they could not aim at it. They had to execute a radical maneuver known to river pilots as crabbing. Drivers violently spun their steering wheels, forcing their rudders hard upstream. They had to angle the bows of their trucks at extreme 45-degree angles directly into the biting current, driving diagonally against the flood just to maintain a straight lateral line across the river. The crossing became a deafening test of mechanical endurance. The six-cylinder engines screamed at maximum RPM, spewing dark clouds of exhaust over the water as the propeller fought just to keep the vehicles from drifting backward. Progress was agonizingly slow, measured in yards per minute. Drivers had to read the swirling surface currents in the dark, dodging floating logs that could easily shear a propeller blade in half. A single stalled engine meant instant drift, leaving an unarmored truck helpless in the crosshairs of German observers. Yet, against the overwhelming physical force of the river, the line held. One by one, the heavy tires struck the submerged gravel of the eastern bank. The drivers shifted back into six-wheel drive, the axles gripped the riverbed, and the dripping trucks lumbered out of the water, delivering critical cargo directly to the fighting infantry. They had survived the initial terrifying plunge, but overcoming the river's initial shock was only the first step. Keeping those heavy hulls afloat across hundreds of continuous, exhausting crossings would demand the awakening of a massive, around-the-clock logistical machine. Once the first waves of amphibious trucks clawed their heavy rubber tires onto the gravel of the eastern embankments, they did not linger to celebrate their survival. The ruthless, logistical doctrine of the river crossing demanded a continuous, unbreakable loop of supply and extraction. As soon as the DUKWs breached the muddy shoreline, infantrymen and quartermaster troops swarmed the vehicles. The heavy wooden crates of 105mm artillery shells, tightly packed boxes of .30 caliber machine gun ammunition, and essential crates of medical plasma were hurriedly unstrapped and thrown down to the waiting soldiers securing the perimeter. But the operational cycle of the DUKW was only half complete. The moment the cargo beds were emptied of their lethal hardware, they were immediately repurposed for a far more desperate cargo. Field medics rushed forward through the mud, carefully sliding rigid canvas stretchers over the low steel gunnels of the trucks. The critically wounded, men suffering from the concussion of mortar blasts or the tearing impact of shrapnel, were secured directly to the floorboards of the amphibious vehicles. Within mere minutes of touching German soil, the drivers were violently shifting their gears once again, swinging their blunt steel bows around and pointing their machines back toward the churning, freezing water of the Rhine. The return trip was equally treacherous, fighting the same violent lateral currents, but it firmly established the fundamental rhythm of the entire operation. This was not a one-way delivery system. It was a pulsating, mechanical artery. On the relatively secure western bank, vast supply dumps had been meticulously organized and hidden beneath sprawling acres of camouflage netting. Quartermaster battalions, operating several miles inland and safely out of range of most German field guns, managed mountains of material. Standard 2.5-ton supply trucks, entirely bound to the land, would constantly dump their heavy loads at these staging areas. The DUKWs would then swallow this cargo, transforming into mobile, floating warehouses. They rolled in long, continuous convoys down the muddy, rutted approach roads, slipped seamlessly into the violent currents of the river, delivered their tonnage to the eastern bank, extracted the casualties, and returned to the western shore to begin the massive cycle all over again. The sheer volume of material entering the water, minute by minute, was staggering, and the fluid nature of this supply line began to fundamentally break the defensive architecture of the enemy. For the German officers observing the sprawling river valley through trench periscopes and high-powered Zeiss artillery optics, this relentless, fluid movement across the water was entirely outside their tactical calculations. German military intelligence had spent weeks intensely analyzing the massive Allied buildup on the western shore. Their defensive strategy, formulated by experienced Wehrmacht commanders, was rigidly anchored to the traditional historical expectations of heavy river crossings. German military doctrine dictated a simple, undeniable reality. A modern, mechanized army could not sustain a major offensive across a major waterway without constructing fixed, high-capacity bridges. They knew that the initial waves of Allied infantry could easily cross in small wooden stormboats, but infantry alone, armed only with the weapons they could carry, could not hold ground against organized armored counterattacks. To move the massive, war-winning tonnage, the Sherman tanks, the heavy artillery batteries, the millions of rounds of small arms ammunition, and the necessary fuel, the Allies would be absolutely forced to build pontoon bridges and cable-operated heavy ferries. And those massive engineering structures required very specific, geographically favorable choke points. You could not build a heavy treadway bridge just anywhere. You needed firm approaches, specific current conditions, and accessible road networks on both sides. German artillery commanders had therefore concentrated their remaining 88mm flak batteries and heavy mortar teams precisely on these logical, predictable locations. They possessed pre-registered firing coordinates for every viable ferry slip and bridgehead approach. They were actively waiting for the massive, paralyzed traffic jams, the stationary engineering equipment, and the highly vulnerable loading ramps to materialize in their crosshairs. They expected to crush the Allied invasion by simply strangling its rigid, inescapable bottlenecks. But as the morning fog began to lift and burn off over the violent surface of the Rhine, the frantic intelligence reports filtering back into the concrete German command bunkers painted a baffling and deeply alarming picture. Forward observation posts were not reporting massive bridge construction at the expected pre-targeted choke points. Instead, they were calling in confused, erratic sightings of large, unarmored trucks simply driving out of the water at completely random intervals, often miles away from the predicted and targeted landing zones. The frustration within the German artillery batteries mounted rapidly as the reality of this decentralized Allied logistical web became apparent. The entire German defensive plan was meticulously designed to destroy fixed infrastructure, but they were suddenly faced with an impossible tactical question. How do you effectively destroy a supply line that has no fixed infrastructure? When German spotters finally managed to locate a temporary concentration of Allied activity, perhaps a makeshift ferry slip or a flat stretch of muddy embankment being utilized as a primary loading zone, they would eagerly radio in the exact coordinates. The remaining German gun crews would swiftly adjust their elevation and windage dials, and high-explosive shells would rain down onto the riverbank. The impacts would tear apart the shoreline, shattering wooden ferry ramps, turning the staging areas into impassable, muddy craters, and sending massive plumes of water and earth high into the sky. By all conventional military metrics, a concentrated artillery barrage of that magnitude should have completely halted the Allied crossing at that specific sector for several hours, while combat engineers scrambled to rebuild the ramps. But the amphibious trucks simply absorbed the disruption without breaking their rhythm. As the artillery shells churned the expected landing zones into deadly traps, the incoming fleet of DUKWs on the water did not stop, panic, or pile up in a highly vulnerable traffic jam on the opposite shore. The drivers, seeing the geysers of water and smoke erupting ahead of them, simply adjusted their steering wheels. They allowed the violent 7-knot current to carry them a half-mile further downstream to a new, completely undamaged stretch of shoreline. They drove their spinning tires up the natural banks, bypassed the ruined ferry sites entirely, and deposited their crucial cargo exactly where the advancing infantry needed it most. The Wehrmacht artillery crews were burning through their severely limited, irreplaceable stockpiles of heavy ammunition, firing brilliantly calculated strikes at static targets and muddy riverbanks, while the Allied supply chain simply flowed around the destruction like water routing itself around a stone. This highly fluid, deeply adaptable logistical maneuvering did not exist in isolation. It was intimately integrated into a massive, heavily interlocked machine of transport that was rapidly transforming the entire surface of the Rhine. As the morning progressed into the afternoon, the river became a heavily congested, incredibly chaotic, and highly dangerous military highway. The slow, lumbering, deeply laden DUKWs were forced to share the treacherous, swirling currents with a dense swarm of other Allied vessels. Fast, agile wooden storm boats, powered by heavy outboard motors, zipped back and forth across the water, rapidly ferrying fresh platoons of infantry to reinforce the expanding eastern bridgehead. Simultaneously, amidst the chaos of the crossing, Allied combat engineering battalions were deeply engaged in the agonizing, highly exposed, and physically brutal work of constructing the heavy treadway and pneumatic pontoon bridges. These engineers wrestled massive, unwieldy rubber floats and heavy steel deck panels into the freezing, fast-moving water. They were fighting a desperate battle against both the sheer hydraulic force of the river's current and the intermittent deadly snap of German sniper fire attempting to pick them off the exposed structures. The true genius of the Allied crossing plan lay in exactly how these wildly different systems of transport supported and shielded each other. The entire operation was designed with a massive, intentional layer of mechanical redundancy. The commanders knew they could not stop the German artillery from eventually hitting their targets. When the inevitable happened, when a perfectly aimed German 88mm shell found its mark and shattered a critical section of a partially constructed pontoon bridge, violently deflating the rubber floats and sending heavy steel panels sinking into the murky depths, the invasion did not pause to mourn or regroup. The moment a fixed bridge was compromised or a heavy ferry was sunk by mortar fire, the quartermaster commanders monitoring the operation from the safety of the western bank immediately increased the operational tempo of the DUKW companies. Dozens of amphibious trucks, held in reserve in the muddy staging areas, instantly surged into the water to cover the sudden, dangerous shortfall in cargo tonnage. The drivers skillfully wove their heavy, unarmored vehicles between the sinking debris of the ruined bridges, navigating carefully around the desperate combat engineers attempting to secure the broken spans. They maintained the relentless forward momentum of the supply chain, ensuring that the infantry, fighting block by block on the eastern bank, never felt the interruption in their ammunition supply. The flexible swimming trucks essentially acted as a dynamic, living bandage, instantly sealing over any logistical wound inflicted by the German defenders. By midday, the crossing of the Rhine presented an awe-inspiring, terrifying spectacle of sheer industrial might. Thousands of tons of supplies, everything from heavy artillery shells and mortar rounds to rations, medical equipment, and communication wire, were moving across the treacherous water in a continuous, overlapping, and seemingly unstoppable flow. The system was designed so that no single failure could halt the advance. If a heavy steel cable on a raft ferry snapped under the immense tension of the current, the fleets of DUKWs were immediately there to carry the load. If a wooden storm boat was swamped by the wake of a larger vessel or capsized by a near miss from an artillery shell, the amphibious trucks were uniquely positioned to maneuver close, pull the surviving infantrymen from the freezing, fast-moving water, and deliver the salvaged equipment to the far shore. From the elevated, highly secure observation posts situated on the bluffs of the Western Heights, senior Allied commanders watched the massive operation unfold with a sense of deep, calculated satisfaction. Looking down through their trench binoculars, the sprawling logistical web appeared as a flawless, unstoppable system of modern military engineering. The highly flexible, deeply unpredictable nature of the DUKW fleets had completely neutralized the rigid, easily targetable bottlenecks that the entire German defensive strategy relied upon. The Wehrmacht artillery observers were being systematically starved of the static, concentrated targets they so desperately needed to hit to turn the tide of the battle. The Allied war machine was executing a textbook, perfectly synchronized river crossing, overcoming the brutal natural hydrology of the Rhine and the dug-in, highly experienced German artillery with nothing but sheer, overwhelming industrial redundancy. It looked, by every observable metric from the safety of the shoreline, like an absolute, frictionless triumph of logistical planning and mechanical technology. From the outside, looking down at the sweeping panorama of the river valley, the crossing was a clear masterpiece of military logistics, a seamless, floating highway of steel and rubber that was actively, visibly breaking the back of the German defense. But this sweeping, macroscopic view of the battlefield hid a dark, rapidly deteriorating, and highly dangerous reality. The commanding officers, observing the flawless flow of traffic from the safety of the western bluffs, could not see the freezing river water slowly rising inside the steel hulls. They could not hear the agonizing, high-pitched mechanical screams of the heavily overloaded truck engines as they fought a losing battle against the relentless speed of the current. Beneath the surface of this perceived logistical miracle, inside the claustrophobic, exhaust-choked, and freezing cabs of the amphibious trucks, a hidden and incredibly desperate crisis was already unfolding. Post-war newsreels and official military histories often present the DUKW as a flawless mechanical savior, a triumph of industrial engineering that effortlessly paved the Allied road into Germany. But deeply buried within the archival unit logs of the quartermaster battalions is a drastically different, far more precarious reality. The amphibious trucks were not gracefully conquering the Rhine. They were physically destroying themselves in the process. The standard 104 horsepower engine, perfectly adequate for a flat highway supply run or a brief sprint through rolling ocean surf, was catastrophically underpowered for the relentless, sustained brutality of a 7-knot river current. To keep from being swept downstream, drivers had to pin their throttles wide open, running the 6-cylinder engines at absolute maximum RPM for agonizingly long stretches. The mechanical toll was immediate and devastating. Transmissions overheated and seized. Clutches burned out under the unnatural torque required to crab heavily loaded hulls diagonally against the floodwater. Drive shafts vibrated so violently they threatened to shear directly off their mounts. Within just a few hours of the initial assault, the muddy staging areas on the western bank transformed into frantic, chaotic triage centers. Mud-caked mechanics waged a desperate battle, cannibalizing parts from completely dead vehicles, working on scorching hot engine blocks with bare hands, and pushing half-repaired trucks back into the freezing water simply because the infantry on the far shore could not survive without them. These mechanical failures were only half the nightmare. The DUKW was fundamentally a hollow steel tub, and when loaded to its absolute maximum capacity with 2.5 tons of high-explosive artillery shells, it operated with terrifyingly little freeboard. Just inches of thin, unarmored steel separated the heavy cargo from the churning river. Every violent eddy in the current, every sudden wake from a passing storm boat, and every geyser from a distant artillery near miss sent freezing water pouring over the low gunnels. The internal bilge pumps, frequently clogged by river mud and battlefield debris, simply could not keep up with the rapidly rising water level inside the hulls. Survival quickly came down to brute human endurance. Drivers and co-drivers, exhausted and soaked to the bone in the freezing March weather, were forced into a terrifying, multitasking fight for their lives. While one man wrestled with the heavy steering wheel, desperately trying to read the deadly cross-currents, the other frantically bailed water out of the sinking cab using discarded ammunition tins, helmets, or anything else they could grab. The trucks were not sustaining the invasion on their own. They were being kept afloat by the sheer willpower of quartermaster crews, who understood that if they stopped pumping for even a minute, their overloaded vehicles would plunge to the bottom of the Rhine like stones. By the late afternoon, the entire amphibious logistical web was teetering on the edge of total collapse. The maintenance units were bleeding operational vehicles faster than they could salvage them, and a critical mass of the fleet was running on engines that were literally tearing themselves apart from the inside. The surviving crews were pushing their dying machines to the absolute breaking point just to keep a minimum volume of ammunition flowing. And this moment of extreme mechanical vulnerability, when the trucks and the men driving them had absolutely nothing left to give, was the exact moment the German artillery commanders on the eastern ridges finalized their adjusted firing solutions, preparing to unleash their most concentrated and devastating counterattack of the entire operation. When the anticipated German barrage finally broke, it did not arrive as scattered, harassing fire. It fell as a synchronized, mathematical grid of destruction. Batteries of Wehrmacht 88mm guns and heavy mortars, perfectly camouflaged in the eastern ridges, unleashed a devastating concentration of high explosives directly onto the most vulnerable points of the Allied crossing. The primary targets were exactly what German military doctrine dictated: the fixed engineering infrastructure. Within minutes, the agonizing progress of the combat engineers was violently dismantled. Geysers of muddy water and jagged steel shrapnel erupted along the M2 treadway bridges that were slowly inching across the channel. Direct hits shattered the heavy pneumatic floats. The air hissed violently as massive rubber pontoons rapidly deflated, collapsing the heavy steel deck panels into the churning river. Cable-operated ferries, tethered to fixed loading ramps on the riverbanks, were instantly pinned down, their crews forced to take cover in muddy craters as mortar rounds walked methodically across their staging areas. The static, rigid supply lines, the heavy arteries meant to carry the invasion, were suddenly severed. On the eastern bank, the tactical situation for the forward assault battalions became immediately critical. The infantry were locked in brutal, close-quarters firefights, frantically trying to expand the bridgehead against probing German counterattacks. But without the heavy ferries and treadway spans, the vital flow of artillery shells, mortar rounds, and small arms ammunition abruptly halted. The ticking clock of the bridgehead had reached its most dangerous hour. If the ammunition ran out, the isolated infantry would be crushed against the river. With the fixed bridges out of commission, the survival of the entire operation fell squarely onto the shoulders of the quartermaster companies operating the exhausted, failing DUKW flotillas. There was no time to wait for the barrage to lift. The amphibious trucks had to go back into the water, driving directly into the impact zone. The crossing that followed was a masterpiece of desperate, improvised survival. Heavily laden DUKWs, their engines already stretched to the breaking point and their bilges flooded, descended the muddy western banks under a sky torn apart by airbursts. As they plunged into the 7-knot current, they were no longer just fighting the hydraulic force of the river. They were navigating through a lethal gauntlet of artillery fire. High explosive shells detonated against the surface of the Rhine, sending massive columns of freezing water crashing down over the open cabs. The unarmored, deeply loaded hulls offered absolutely no protection. Shrapnel tore through the thin sheet metal of the floating trucks, instantly turning minor leaks into catastrophic flooding. For the drivers and co-drivers, the crossing devolved into a terrifying test of nerve. Overheating engines screamed at maximum RPM, fighting the lateral drift while desperately trying to weave between the sinking debris of destroyed pontoon bridges and the towering geysers of mortar strikes. When a DUKW took shrapnel below the waterline, the crews could not stop. They kept the throttles pinned wide open, steering their crabbing, sinking vehicles diagonally against the floodwater, frantically bailing the rising river from their cabs with their steel helmets or empty ammunition tins. They drove their damaged machines out of the water and onto the eastern shore, their tires slipping on the mud, delivering crates of ammunition to infantrymen who were down to their last magazines. As soon as the cargo beds were empty, the bleeding and waterlogged trucks turned right back into the artillery storm to repeat the cycle. For several agonizing hours, the entire weight of the Allied advance hung by this fragile, floating thread. The continuous loop of the DUKWs became the only functioning supply line, bypassing the shattered infrastructure and rendering the massive German artillery concentration ultimately ineffective. The amphibious trucks kept the bridgehead breathing, moving just enough tonnage through the barrage to hold the line until the deafening artillery fire finally slackened and the combat engineers could drag replacement pontoons into the water to repair the static spans. The heavy bridges would eventually carry the tanks into the heart of Germany, but those brutal, desperate hours in the churning river proved a fundamental truth about the entire Rhine operation. The truth, forged in the freezing currents of the Rhine, answered the very question that seemed so impossible just hours before. How did a fleet of awkward, unarmored, deeply flawed vehicles, originally designed for flat ocean beaches, manage to survive a raging river and keep an entire invasion from stalling? The answer is that they did not achieve this by being indestructible, nor did these amphibious trucks win the battle single-handedly. To claim that the DUKW alone broke the German defenses on the eastern bank would be a profound misunderstanding of how this massive operation actually functioned. Instead, these fragile, underpowered machines provided something far more vital to the survival of the infantry: the absolute critical margin of error. When the Wehrmacht artillery crews successfully executed their defensive doctrine, when they perfectly dialed in their pre-registered coordinates, shattered the heavy pontoon bridges, and pinned down the cable ferries, they expected the invasion to suffocate. In any traditional military equation, destroying the primary crossing infrastructure should have been a decisive, fatal blow to an advancing army. But the Allied crossing strategy was not built on the hope of a perfect, uninterrupted operation. It was engineered with the explicit expectation of localized failure. By operating directly alongside the agile wooden stormboats and the highly vulnerable pneumatic bridges, the DUKWs completed a relentless, overlapping web of transport. They ensured that even when one vital piece of the logistical network was violently torn away, the flow of men and material never completely stopped. If a heavy treadway span collapsed into the channel under mortar fire, the amphibious trucks simply absorbed the operational burden, bypassing the ruined choke point and delivering ammunition straight to the muddy front-line foxholes. This dynamic adaptation represented a fatal collision of military philosophies. The German High Command had staked the defense of their homeland on the hope of delivering a single, decisive tactical strike against a rigid target. But they were fighting an enemy that had completely decentralized its lifeblood. The true Allied advantage revealed on the waters of the Rhine did not lie in executing perfect battlefield tactics or deploying flawless, invincible machines, as the exhausted quartermaster crews proved, while frantically bailing water from their sinking, overheating cabs. The machinery of war was incredibly fragile and constantly teetering on the edge of failure. The actual advantage was an overwhelming, deeply interconnected logistical redundancy. It was a system of supply so vast, so flexible, and so inherently resilient that it could simply absorb catastrophic damage and keep moving forward. By refusing to rely on a single point of failure, this floating highway of vulnerable steel and rubber achieved something unprecedented. It rendered the localized, highly accurate tactical successes of the German artillery completely and utterly meaningless. The crossing of the Rhine stands as a definitive testament to the brutal reality of industrial warfare. When the history of the Western Front is recorded, the focus naturally drifts toward the fast-moving armored spearheads, the massive airborne drops, and the strategic bombing campaigns. Yet the physical reality of actually marching into the German heartland required something far more foundational than sweeping tactical maneuvers. The Rhine, a seemingly insurmountable natural fortress backed by deeply entrenched, mathematically precise artillery, was not conquered by a single stroke of military genius. It was systematically dismantled, hour by agonizing hour, by muddy, overheating engines, exhausted quartermaster crews bailing freezing water from sinking steel tubs, and a grinding logistical machine that simply outpaced the enemy's capacity to destroy it. The final geographic barrier to the Third Reich was ultimately breached not by a legendary heroic charge, but by an unglamorous, exhaust-choked web of supply lines that absolutely refused to break.